What's that? Good evening. Good evening, can I ask... Whoops, that was far too loud. Good evening, can I ask everyone to take a seat, please? I'm just very briefly going to welcome you to tonight's Community Summit, and then I'm going to hand over to Bailey Russell Robertson, who's going to give you the more formal welcome to tonight's proceedings. My name's Shaw Anderson, and I manage the community planning teams that operate across the city. So there's some necessary housekeeping just to mention to you. In the event of the fire alarm going off, and surprise, surprise, there is no test planned, we will all exit by the main doors at the back, which you come in through, and go down the marble staircase. The assembly point for everyone is opposite the main door of the city chambers, adjacent to the cenotaph. Also, if anyone needs to use the facilities, the toilets are also back out through that door and round to the left. They are signposted, there's several signs, and they're very close to where we are. Now, apart from that, I've got one more thing, and I'll do it in the Glasgow vernacular. If you've got your mobile phone, can you ensure it's off or on silent? That would be very helpful and avoid any embarrassment for MD or any interference. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to formally ask Bailey Russell Robertson to launch proceedings for this evening. Bailey Robertson.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you and a warm welcome to the beautiful, the magnificent banqueting hall in your city chambers for tonight's Community Summit. I see many familiar faces, which is great to see, but I'm hoping to see more of the folk I don't know, either through proceedings or through the breaks or later on. For those who do not know me, I am Bailey Russell Robertson, and I've been recently made the chair of the Glasgow Community Planning Partnership, and I'm the Deputy City Convener for Empowering Communities. It is my absolute pleasure to be hosting you tonight, and I'm thrilled at the number of people who have taken the time out of their busy schedules to come along tonight. Such is the enthusiasm and dedication of Glasgow's communities, organisations and groups. We filled the City Chamber's largest hall with really more than a week to spare. So truly welcome everyone, and can I also welcome all our viewers watching tonight's proceedings through our live stream. I don't think I need a hard sell to convince this room that Glasgow is a fantastic city. It's an unbelievable city, a proud city with much to be proud about. We are a city of communities. Ask any Glaswegian where they're from. You'll be told they're from Cranhill, where I represent, Govan, Drumchapel. You will hear Glasgow. We are not just proud of our city and its fantastic history, but of our own individual areas, our communities, our neighbours, ourselves. I am proud to hail from the East End of Glasgow, and I have spent the best part of over 4 decades working across local government, health, social care, housing and homelessness arenas. It might seem strange for politicians to lead in a long campaign to gain power in their city, and then they try to give some of that power to others. You'll hear more. But that's exactly what we are seeking to do, and here's why. I genuinely, passionately believe that it's only by empowering and supporting local communities that we can help them transform their areas to deliver the change that they require, they want, they lead on. Our vision for Great Glasgow is to be a world-class city with thriving, resilient communities where everyone can flourish and benefit from the city's success. We can better achieve this if we bring together various organisations working collaboratively together and work in partnership and share expertise, knowledge to achieve our goals, the city's goals. You know better than anyone the needs and aspirations of the communities you live in and you work in and you serve in. That is why I'm determined as your chair to ensure Glasgow's communities have the tools, the knowledge, the support to revitalise this city and together harness the benefits for the city and for its people. And this is the mission statement at the heart of tonight's summit. I am proud to be the chair of Glasgow's Community Planning Partnership. We provide a focus for partnership that seeks to ensure that your public services might also meet the needs of its local people, particularly those upon who rely on your services, the most vulnerable and the most need. That is why this evening, that is what it's all about, bringing together representatives from our wonderful, thriving communities. Learn from each other, share expertise, knowledge, better understand one another's roles, think differently on how we improve Glasgow and the lives of Glaswegians. That's what my theme, and that's what I keep coming back to, the city and its people. Tonight you will hear from speakers and others later on after the break, the workshops, who are involved in bringing about change. Change that has now been given a focus by new legislation and by the approach being taken by Glasgow City Council. Speaking tonight, and to my left or your right, depends where you're sitting, is a new friend of mine, I think I can say that, Dr. Oliver Escobar, who is amongst other things a lecturer in public policy at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of What Works Scotland, a large research programme to support improved public services. Dr. Escobar will be focusing on the devolution of power and how communities themselves can be empowered and empower themselves. Alan Budge is an expert in participatory budgeting who will be speaking about the opportunities that can be realised when people who live in their communities effectively shape, influence decision-making, public services, delivery, in fact, all aspects of public expenditure in our communities. Linda Gillespie from Development Trust Association Scotland, who will be discussing asset transfer, a relatively recent development through which community ownership of land, buildings can contribute to confident, better resource, more sustainable local communities across Scotland. And last but not least, the last speaker will be Brendan Frankgate from Land and Environmental Services, who will outline how he sees active citizenship as a central, that's the word, a central part of frontline service delivery, and how land and environmental services, LES in its vernacular, are engaging with local communities to improve their local activities and the services that they need. I'm sure that out of these presentations and the workshops that will follow, we can start a journey that will lead to Glasgow being a better place to live, Glasgow a better place that engages, and better for Glasgow citizens. I would also like to say a few words about the draft community plan, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. As part of the Community Empowerment Act, which we will hear more about tonight, the Glasgow Community Planning Partnership is required to produce a citywide local outcome improvement plan known as LOOP. That's a LIP, I've not quite worked that out yet, but in a more serious note is to tackle issues that partners agree working together in terms of citywide priorities. Glasgow recently published its draft LOOP. We're calling it, this is much better, the Glasgow Community Plan. It gives ownership, it gives a localised feel towards it, and it gives that empowerment. It's Glasgow's. And we are looking for your views on the draft priorities that have been identified. The consultation process finishes on the 31st of this month. You can look online to learn more, and we have a stall out at the back where you go for your teas and coffees at the break, and you can learn more. There's more physical, robust information on the process. Finally, the purpose of the consultation is to ensure that Glasgow Community Plan belongs to the entire city, not one department, not one administration, not one council. It belongs to the people of Glasgow. It will shape its priorities, it will not just by the partners, not just yourselves, but the public and community groups. And I'm keen to make that connection. And tonight's theme for me as well is about connecting this room, it's about connectivity. This should lead to a greater local resilience and communities that feel involved, empowered, supported to do it for themselves. And I'd just like to finish up by saying all of us in this hall, We have a great responsibility to ensure we harness our energies, our talents in our communities and use it to make a difference to local people. Let's deliver. So please contribute to this evening and help us answer the fundamental questions that we face. Questions about how we better deliver and better design local services, how we together create and rediscover community assets, better use of assets, resources, how do we work together to utilise the undoubted skills, strength, qualities, capacity out there in our communities, how best practice in my community, your community, our communities make things better in Pollock and Govan and Easterhouse and Milton and Parkhead. What can we learn from the people out there, from our cities, from our communities, also from across the world? That is the task. It's simple. It's not new. It's simple. How can we all face and reason this and do it together? This is why we're here tonight. My promise, my commitment as your chair to you all is I will listen, I will learn, I will empower, I will share to build a better Glasgow we all want to see. I genuinely, truly look forward to working with you all tonight in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bailey Robertson. It's my great pleasure now to invite Dr. Oliver Escobar to come and speak to us on the subject matter of empowering communities, devolving power. Oliver.
Hello, how are you doing? I'm gonna try to be disciplined and keep it to 20 minutes. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And it's good to be a stream in the live stream as well. So it's easier to tell my wife what do I do when I come all these evenings to Glasgow, which is always a difficult conversation. So hello Edinburgh, and also hello Poland. Apparently my in-laws are looking as well. I want to use this opportunity to try and share a few ideas. Some of you who have been engaged in these conversations for some time now, for the last few years, as some of this empowerment agenda has been gaining momentum, will be very familiar with some of these ideas. So forgive me if you've heard this before. But usually in previous occasions when I came to share some of the stories and the things we learned through research at the University of Edinburgh, the What Works in Scotland program, usually I focus on processes, examples, of deliberative processes, participatory processes, and so on. Today I'm going to avoid that because I think we're going to get hands-on with some more specific examples in the other presentations and the workshops. And I'm going to focus on more general ideas, the context for what's going to be hopefully happening in Glasgow over the next few years. And this seems to me there are very few occasions that allow for democratic innovation. One of the best windows of opportunity for democratic innovation and community empowerment is when there's a change of administration, and that is what's happened in Glasgow. So there's an opportunity here to use that window of opportunity and make sure that the empowerment agenda gets to the next stage in Glasgow. And we're not starting from zero. You've been doing lots of work for many years, of course. I don't think I need to tell you why community participation and empowerment matters, but sometimes it's good to remind ourselves that it's not just because it's nice to have a good functioning democracy, but because it is crucial in order to solve problems, address local issues, develop better services, better policies, and so on, as well as developing more interesting and vibrant forms of citizenship that help to make our communities resilient and vibrant. So there is an instrumental reason to do this, as well as the moral and value-laden reason, because it's right and we need to upgrade our democracy to face the challenges of the 21st century. Some people think that there is such thing as public apathy. And this is one of my bugbears because humans are not naturally apathetic. Apathy takes a lot of hard work to produce. And one could argue that sometimes our institutions have become really good at constructing and fabricating apathy. And that works well for a society that for many years was happy to be run by a few elites, but the times are changing, and the way we govern ourselves and the way our democracy is developed and deepened is now at stake, and lots of things happening around the world warn us against complacency. Civic participation in Scotland is actually amongst some of the highest in the developed world, and you can see some of the figures on the screen. Of course, the independence referendum was a key milestone, but we do have a vibrant ecosystem of development trusts, social enterprises, of course across the voluntary sector, and so on and so forth. And when we look at the figures, civic participation has been on the rise in the last few years. The referendum was an important stimulus, but it's nothing new to Scotland, with a long tradition of community education and development. There's an interesting figure there. You can see it says that over 40% engage in active participation. That means participation that is beyond clicking a petition or just doing something a little bit more passive. But I want to bring your attention to that figure at the bottom. 7% of the respondents to the survey say that they volunteer 13 times or more. And that shows to me is that the burden of doing community work, the burden of doing community leadership, the burden of developing ideas, solving problems, making connections, developing networks, is falling on quite a few, just a few individuals actually, and the burnout in our communities and amongst our community leaders is very high. So we need to be mindful of that and expand the circle, and hopefully that's what's about to happen in the next few years in Glasgow. Across Scotland, the picture is quite interesting because the community empowerment agenda doesn't come out of thin air. There's a high level of civic aspiration. You can see some of the figures. I can't see them that very well from here, but it does show that figure that only 35% of the population feel that they have some influence in the decisions that affect their communities. Is quite an indictment on a democratic society, I would argue. And you can see the rest of the figures, the 77%, the 80%, the 90%, they do point to a willingness amongst the population to take up opportunities to participate if those opportunities are the right opportunities. And I'll come back to this in a wee while. A lot of this mood was captured by the Kozla Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy. You might remember it. It was in 2014. There was a report. It's available online. You can check it. A lot of the things that were explored in the commission are now coming to fruition. Of course, the Community Empowerment Act is already live, and in some ways this has an influence in that. But there are many other issues, and in particular the issue of subsidiarity, how to devolve power to communities, is something that was emphasized by the Commission. And they made an explicit link between the lack of local democracy, the lack of local control, the lack of community empowerment, and the persistence of inequalities. If you don't have control and power to shape with others your community, then your voice is not heard, it's not reflected in the policy agenda, and your priorities are not there, and therefore it's not surprised that inequalities remain. But the policy context in Scotland has never been more positive for this agenda. As you might know, there is going to be a series of reviews, including the review of community councils. We are currently working on this with the Scottish Community Development Centre, and there's an opportunity to rethink how do we support community councils and how we develop the community councils and how we can reimagine community councils so that they can take up a more prominent role and a more central role in our communities, and how they are supported to do that well, and how do they themselves become more democratic, because let's be honest, it is a challenge. Not all our community councils are run in the most democratic ways, and that's across the country, that's not just in Glasgow. The Community Empowerment Agenda, you are familiar with it. There's the Open Government Partnership. There are all sorts of things happening in civil society and at policy level that seem to be creating a context where we can hopefully move forward with this agenda. Now, at this point, after a slide on policy, I think it's good to wake up and move a bit. So I'm not going to ask you to move, but I'm going to ask you to play with me on a little exercise. Some of you may have done this before. All you need to do is to stand up if in the last 12 months you took part in a community forum to discuss community issues or policy issues. So Please stand up if you've taken part in one of those. Okay, so now thinking about that process and thinking about that forum, stay standing, you can stay standing if there was a reasonable gender balance. Okay, that's quite good. How about a mix of personal and professional backgrounds? Yeah, it gets a little bit harder to. And how about a variety of perspectives and opinions? Because it's really easy to meet with people who think like you think. It's really easy to meet with the like-minded. The challenge is to meet and engage in dialogue with those who think very differently from you. And how about 3 generations in one room, under one roof? Yeah, it becomes harder, But there are a few in the room, and I hope you're gonna stay standing. Let's see. How about, this is difficult to tell, but was there a reasonable mix of backgrounds, and in that sense, not just a particular section, as in, let's say, middle class? Okay. And how about a sense amongst participants that they felt included and also influential? Okay, there are still a few people standing and a hand there as well. I really, really hope someone remains standing by the end of this. How about a sense of joy? Because who said that democracy needs to be a sad business? Okay, yes. And the final one, how about, was there a reasonable sense that participating in that forum will make a real difference, will have a real impact? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so we got a few people in the room. You can sit down. Thank you. The point is to illustrate how difficult it is to bring together in our community work, in local participatory processes, bring together true diversity, a true reflection of the diversity of a community. And that's a challenge shared across the globe. Democracy is not easy, and bringing in to these processes a true reflection of the mix of people and perspectives in the city is a real challenge, and a challenge we're going to have to grapple with if we are serious about developing an ambitious empowerment agenda in Glasgow. And in a sense, it's important to remind ourselves that not all participation and not all forms of local engagement are necessarily good. There is such thing as bad participation and bad engagement. And one of the interesting things in the last 50 years or so is that we have ever-growing consultation, ever-growing participation, and yet ever-growing inequalities. How can that be? Surely if more people is participating, their priorities get reflected, and therefore then we tackle inequalities, we address issues and so on. But what's happening, of course, is that a lot of the participatory processes that dominate the mainstream tend to be quite tokenistic, consultations that really are already shaped by a particular agenda, and forms of participation that might allow you to choose what should be the color of the fences, but has nothing to say about the public services and the building and the substance of a particular space. And this is really problematic because in many ways, the inequalities of health, income, wealth, and so on that afflict our society have a direct connection, in my view, to inequalities in power. If there are inequalities in the power and influence that certain citizens and communities have, then, and if we look at data across the globe, we tend to see that it's only certain sections of the population that make the most of opportunities to participate. So it tends to be people from higher incomes, higher levels of education, and so on. It tends to be a very specific section of the population in terms of gender, ethnicity, and so on. So it is very problematic, because then that means that the policy agenda is only shaped by that particular section of the population, and hence inequalities perpetuate themselves. So these things are connected. The democratic innovation agenda, the democratic renewal agenda, and the social justice agenda cannot be separated. The process and the outcomes, they matter on equal measure. And in terms of the next few years and the ambitions of the new administration in terms of developing or advancing the community empowerment agenda in Glasgow, I imagine that some of the challenges we are going to face are going to be the challenges we've seen over the last decades across developed democracies. They always seem to be the same. There are three core components: inclusion and diversity. How do you ensure that your community process, your participatory budgeting, or your local committee, how do you ensure that they are truly inclusive and diverse, truly welcoming, and truly shaped in a way that allows everyone to participate and influence? The second challenge is the challenge of the quality of the conversations we have, because as humans we tend to develop habits and patterns of interaction, and it's really difficult to open up new conversations, to have difficult conversations with people we disagree with. That requires a really high quality of dialogue and a really high quality of deliberation. And finally, the one that always comes up is, okay, is this going to make a difference? Is this going to have an impact? Is this going to shape the final decisions? Is this going to be transparent? Are we going to understand how our participation has contributed to shape this outcome? In a sense, I suppose, there are a series of questions that I find helpful when thinking about developing this agenda, and I thought I would share them with you. I think in 2, 3, 4 years, we will be wanting to ask these kind of questions. There will be many more, of course, but these are some of them. Are we using the power of combining online and offline? Can we make good use of the new opportunities that digital technologies bring? Being mindful, of course, that that brings new inequalities, but also new opportunities to reach groups that otherwise wouldn't engage with the policy process or the political process or the community process. Are we providing opportunities that are that cater to a variety of ways of engaging? Some people can only engage for 20 or 30 minutes a week. Some people might be able to commit a few evenings for meetings. Some people will be able to come into a particular space every once in a while. So we need to try and develop an ecosystem that has light touch forms of participation as well as the deeper forms of participation, and that begins to bring people into that core and into that circle. Are we inclusive? Yeah, I think I touched on this. Are we creating truly inclusive processes where there is not only a variety of demographics, age, ethnicity, gender, and so on, but also a variety of perspectives? It is just as important to have a variety of perspectives. You might have 100 or 200 people in this room, and if you are all very diverse demographically, but you all think the same and have the same type of perspective, arguably that is less diverse than if we had just 10 people that are truly diverse and reflective of the community. So it's not a numbers game, it's much more a diversity game. Then are we creating deliberative spaces? What does that mean? These are spaces where people not only come and just sort of share their particular party line or their bugbear or their complaint. These are places where people come to think together, learn from each other, be exposed to ideas that might challenge their own perspective, and then on the basis of that exposure to other ideas, other arguments, and a variety of evidence, we can come to some form of considered judgments. That's a different quality of conversation from more standard discussions, and it takes a lot of work to develop that kind of a space. Are we providing and facilitating empowered processes? This is the point of our impact. It's not enough just to invite people to participate. It's that old phrase, it's participation in participation. You're just participating in a process, but it's not going to take anywhere. It's not going to take you anywhere. The key here is to make sure that there is a clear transparency. What kind of power are we sharing in this space? What kind of decision-making power are we developing in a collaborative manner, and so on. And let me get to the conclusions, the final 2 slides. There are a number of challenges, and these are not going to be easy, but these are not new challenges, and we do have a lot of research and evidence that might help us to think through some of these challenges. Of course, this requires changing mindsets and ways of working. This is going to defy community leaders, elected councillors, citizens, activists, public and civil servants. It's going to challenge them to have to find new ways of sharing power, opening up the black box of decision making, and creating those kind of exciting platforms and processes that will allow communities to take advantage of this agenda. And this is going to require a form of leadership that unfortunately is not very common. We're very accustomed to traditional sort of authoritarian leadership, the visionary leader that knows the way and takes you there. In today's day, that form of leadership has too often proven dangerous at times. There are some examples globally that I won't touch on. I prefer this form of leadership. This form of leadership is about people who recognize that their job is not to tell the world what needs to happen. Their job is to bring people together, to have difficult conversations, to make things happen. And that requires a complete different set of skills, which is going to require building capacity, developing facilitation, negotiation, mediation, brokering skills, all the kind of soft skills that so far we haven't considered core skills, but that actually are crucial to this agenda. We should be mindful as well that we are going to face the challenge of breaking through profound inequalities of power and influence. And this is not just between authorities and communities, this is within communities as well. The power fights and the power struggles within communities themselves can be a tremendous source of frustration and inaction. So overcoming those inequalities and opening up spaces, opening up your community spaces to a diversity of people is going to be crucial in overcoming that. And this is also, if we are serious about developing a more ambitious community empowerment agenda, this is going to ruffle some feathers. This is not going to sit well with those who already have a seat at the table, who already have channels to shape power, who already have a seat at the tables where the decisions are made. When you try to bring new voices and open it up to the rest of your community, and you make an effort to bring in people who often don't participate, those who are already in that space sometimes might feel their status and power threatened. We need to grapple with this. We need to overcome this. And of course, there is always the risk of tokenism and manipulation. These things can be used for all sorts of undesirable ends, and we always need to keep a critical mind. But hopefully, it's a form of critical commitment and optimism that is not paralyzing, because the problem of going to the far end is to become so cynical that nothing happens, and we just waste our energy discussing amongst ourselves. And this is going to force us as well to think about the long term. These things don't happen overnight. We know it. Some of you in the room, we've been having these conversations for many years. There's going to be a real challenge to try and get our political leaders to provide the framework and the context for this to develop over the longer period of time. And this needs 5-10 years to truly be developed at the level that hopefully we're going to be discussing today. And finally, very, very quickly, I just want to repeat this point from the Coastal Commission. In the end, public authorities and institutions they cannot empower people. Only people can empower themselves. It's not a matter of, we're not talking here about powerless communities. There's tremendous resources and resilience and ideas and knowledge and innovation in our communities. But I think it's fair to say that that doesn't always shape the official agendas as it should. So the last 2 points I want to make. Public authorities can, however, provide the context and the space and the governance and the capacity building that is going to be required for people to be able to take advantage of the Community Empowerment Act and of the rest of policy developments that are in the pipeline. And community leaders, community workers, people who are trying and doing and making a difference in communities will have to, in a sense, continue in many ways the work you've been doing and realize that, that you are the key to enabling this agenda to move forward. And there are a number of roles that will be familiar to you. It's the facilitation role, the critical friend role, and that sense of trying to develop ways of working that are responsive and that acknowledge the level of civic aspiration the real hunger in communities for opportunities to solve local issues, develop new ideas, and unleash all that potential and energy. So I'll conclude just by saying I really, really hope that this is, of course, this is a conversation that builds on many conversations we have had before, but this is also a conversation that is going to frame what's going to happen over the next few years. And changes in administration are very rare opportunities to try and push forward difficult, ambitious agendas like this. I really, really hope we can get there, and of course you are going to be key to this. So I'm looking forward to learning with you and see what we can make happen over the next few years. So thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. We're now at the bit of the agenda which is entitled Table Discussion. So everyone should find 2 questions at your table which are following on from Oliver's presentation. We would invite you now just to discuss amongst yourselves your conclusions or your thoughts on those questions, which hopefully have been provoked a response from Oliver's contribution. There'll be somebody at each table who will facilitate your table and record your thoughts, and I'll come back in a few minutes just to link us in to the next item. Thank you. Colleagues, just another Colleagues, just another couple of minutes and then we'll bring this part of the discussion to a conclusion. 2 more minutes. Colleagues, thank you. Can I just draw everybody's conversations to a conclusion, please? You always feel a bit guilty at a time like this when you're deliberately trying to provoke conversation, and one of the tasks you have is to close conversation down, to keep things to time. Okay. Thank you everyone for the contributions you've made. What we will do now is we'll collate the responses and the thoughts that have been shared round the tables, and we'll make sure that we get a response and feedback out to everyone who has attended this evening. It's now my pleasure to invite my colleague Chris Carris from Mount Florida Community Council, and Chris is going to outline some of the things that his community council is involved in terms of making his community's voice heard. So thank you, Chris. Chris.
Right, good evening everybody. So yeah, Mount Florida Community Council, or MoFlo Coco, as we've given it the name. So Shaw asked me to just share some examples of what a community council might do. There are other community groups, but community council is one type of group that you'd find commonly in Glasgow. There's 79 in Glasgow. And so what you'll see is a few examples of from what we were doing over the last couple of years. There are many other examples and many other better examples. You'll see what we were up to. So quick introduction for myself. Prior to joining the community council, I had no prior experience in community work or anything like that. I'm an engineer by training. I work in manufacturing. And I joined the community council in 2011, which is when I first moved to Glasgow. So a few words about Mount Florida. So Mount Florida is found in the south of Glasgow, south side, and in that area you'll find a variety of different types of housing. So there's in the north there's 400 blocks, in the middle there's tenements and high-rises, and in the southern area you'll find terraced houses, and at the very bottom of the area there's quite desirable sandstone terraced houses. So a big variety of housing conditions. Two big features of the area is first, on Cathcart Road there's the independently owned shops that we're very proud of. It's a big feature, it's really sort of centre of the community, those locally owned shops. And there's the National Stadium, Hampden, is there as well. If I overlay the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, you can see the red area shows pockets of relative deprivation and the blue areas of relative affluence compared to the Scottish averages. So that just shows that we've got a huge variety of people that we're trying to represent. So I'm going to share the case study in 3 parts, and it's going to be structured around the constitutional objectives of all community councils in Glasgow. So all 79 have these same 6 objectives, and as I'm the chair of the community council, so I take it as one of my primary roles is to make sure we stay true to the constitution. We act in line with the constitutional objectives. So a little bit of information is that I put the objectives at the top of every agenda of every meeting, just to remind community councillors, you're not here to talk about the pothole outside your front door, which was a problem in the past. You're here to talk about everybody's needs in the community and to find out what they're interested in and represent their needs. So the first 2 objectives for all community councils they're both talking about ascertaining the views of local people and then articulate them to the relevant authorities. So the first thing we do in this area is to reach out, to make as many people in there as possible aware of our existence and encourage them to get in touch with anything that's on their minds, really. So we put out a newsletter. In fact, it's just being delivered at the moment. I've got some examples if you want to see them. 3,000 printed for 2,700 letterboxes in the area. We have a Facebook following of 1,200, 600 people on Twitter. We do online surveys about particular things. I'll come back to that. So we typically get 300 responses in a year, and we have an email list with 200 people on it as well. So, and then we'll do trying to balance face-to-face versus online participation methods. We also will do events. We'll do consultation events for particular projects, and if a community organisation such as the School Parent Partnership is holding an event, we'll try and get a stall there to, again, have a face-to-face interaction with people. A particular example of ascertaining the views of local people is what we call the Hampden Neighbours Project. And this has been ongoing since 2014 when we had the athletics for the Commonwealth Games held at Hampden. And there's an online survey, people can fill it any time, and we promote it after each major football match and each concert, and we get 300 responses a year, and it's not like a scientific poll of opinion or anything like that. It's just trying to get really, really deep insight on really, really local issues from the people that know them best, the people that live right there. So we have comments about illegal parking, and that's led to insights about where are the particular problems. And we've spoken to the relevant authorities in the council about how they could adjust their enforcement regime. Through discussions with the police, we've used outcomes from the survey to help them plot their patrols outside the stadium to catch the trouble hotspots that we know exist immediately before and immediately after football matches. And littering, so with LES, we are able to direct them to the worst spots immediately needing to clean up after a match. And through the licensing process, we've also, a really important outcome was through the evidence that came out of the survey, we were able to persuade that the provision of portaloos is a requirement of the license for concerts. So that's a big result for us, believe it or not. Okay, so that's some examples of how we're ascertaining the views of local people. The next 2 objectives that all community councils have is all about acting as a voice for the local area. And for this one, I'll just use the examples in the area of planning. So Mount Florida Community Council is one of 5 councils that forms what we call the Victoria Forum. I can see some other members here tonight. And these are community councils that are concerned about the redevelopment of the Victoria Infirmary, which has been vacated by the NHS. And we've talking to Oliver's language of earlier on, we're exploiting the full range of tools afforded to us by the legislation. So we have read the city plan. The city plan says there should be a master plan for the site. We think that's the vehicle to make sure the site is redeveloped to address the needs of the whole area. And through our campaign, we've forced the developer to provide a master plan. And furthermore, we've demonstrated the need for the councillors for the ward to facilitate a working group. So Councillor Archie Graham is facilitating a working group, which met today, in fact, aimed at developing a master plan for the area surrounding the site, not just the site itself. So that's where we've engaged with the planning process and the legislation to try and represent the needs and the opinions of local people. Another example which hasn't gone quite so well is it's just outside the boundary of our site, but there's a supermarket which is to be redeveloped so instead of being one big massive supermarket which doesn't compete with the shops in Mount Florida, it's now going to be a small complex of smaller shops and fast food outlets, which does start to compete with the independently owned shops in our area. That's something we're concerned about. And what we found here was that the developer and its consultants were able to steer their application through the legislation and avoid the need for consultation. And we felt that's an example of being disempowered through the imbalance of power between the developer and the community in the planning process. And that's something I'd ask the panel to consider later on. And if I've got a few minutes left, so I'll just talk the last two objectives on the constitutional objectives. And those are about taking any other action as deemed fit to support the interests of the area. And for this one, I'll talk about a project we call the Leatherby Triangle Project. And it originated in a concern about the amount of littering in the area. And the idea was that instead of just putting pressure on LEF to go around and pick up more and more litter, we would try and foster community spirit, pride in the area, and to, discourage littering in the first place. So we've been generously supported by the Planning Partnership and through the Participatory Budgeting Project. We've gone through a detailed consultation design process aimed at regenerating an underutilised space. So here's a picture of that space. It's a triangle, as you'd expect. And it's, at the moment, it's a little more than a cross between a litter trap, a dog toilet, a traffic island. And the picture you see here is taken from the first floor window of the primary school. So it's in a densely tenemented area. It could be so much more, but it's just sitting there. So we're aiming to do we are driving a community-led project to regenerate that space. So throughout last year and into the beginning of this year, we ran an extensive consultation process with some online consultation, but lots of face-to-face activity. So in the pictures there, you see a consultation exercise carried out by architects paid for from Community Planning Partnership money within the school to get the views of local school children. There's events held in the triangle, in the green space, to clean it up, to talk to people about what that site could be. And there's a design workshop at the bottom right there. That process came up with 3 options, and the preferred option has been identified. And we're now in the process of doing the detailed engineering design. That's the next step. The big thing is to get the people in, recruit new people, the skills that we'll need to steward the amount of money that we'll need to raise for that. So that's an example of taking on our initiative, doing something that has local support and is in the interest of the area. So last slide. So what would help? What would take us to that next level on the journey that we've been on for some time to promote community participation and empowerment? From the point of view of our community councillor, from our experience, the big thing we'd like to help with is about recruitment. So we're looking for help to widen the pool of volunteers that would be willing to take some action and some responsibility on behalf of their community. And there are volunteers out there, but at the moment I think in some places community councils don't always have a good reputation. So someone with the tenacity and the skills that we're looking for might go off somewhere else, which is great. They'll go and run the BB brigade or coach a football team, that's great. But if we can show that community representation has power, is empowered, it's enabled, then we'll get more capable people into community councils. And a second, once we've got them in, we need to develop them. So I think I would ask the council to take I think there's potential for the council to take a more assertive approach in facilitating that, perhaps through independent agencies or NGOs, to avoid any sort of, there are places where people are a bit suspicious about the ulterior motives of the council, but some way of facilitating the share of and the spread of ideas between community councils and other community groups. And the third point I'd ask for help with is about the planning process. And I know there's consultations and activity going to regarding legislation in Scotland, but the current presumption of in favour of development, in favour of the applicant, needs a counterbalance. It just doesn't. The community is disempowered, even when we're enabled with the support of Planning Aid Scotland, to understand the legislation. So what? We can't do anything. We're still disempowered. So the right of community appeal is too strong a counterbalance, but we need something in between. So that would be my plea for help. I hope that the panel can consider that later. So, thank you very much.
Many thanks to Chris for giving some clear examples of how an effective community council can indeed improve the environment, improve things within their community and basically take things forward. So thank you for giving such clear examples, Chris. And Chris is going to be available later on to speak to folks. It's now time for tea and coffee. I'm not quite going to do that line that says you've had your tea, but we are quite tight for time. So I would ask that if you could get up, move about, take advantage of the stalls which are there for your consideration and perusal. But if you could grab a tea or a coffee and bring it back to your tables, and if we could do so timely. And if you leave through the door to the back right, then that would be very helpful. Colleagues will direct you out. Thank you. wherever suits. In order, that would be ideal. Colleagues, can I ask you to take your seats again, please? Okay, if you can perhaps just take your seats, please. We're just about to begin again. Okay, thank you everyone. I hope you have all had an opportunity to have a cup of tea, coffee, and also to go round the stalls. If we can maybe just kill down the conversation just now, that would be appreciated. Thank you. The next stage in this evening's proceedings is we're going to benefit from 3 presentations, and these presentations are going to be on the subject matters of participatory budgeting, asset transfer, and improving your local environment. And my colleagues to my left are just about to go through. Each of them has been allocated 10 to 12 minutes for their presentation, and I've promised them that I'll look over to the right-hand side here if they're overgoing their time. So that's the next stage of proceedings, is these 3 presentations. Once we've heard those 3 presentations, we'll be supporting discussion groups for each of the subject matters. And I'll ask the central column here, who are going to be considering asset transfer, to go through next door to the Satinwood Suite for their discussion. I need to apologise at this stage. The acoustics in this room work against us sometimes. The magnificent ceiling is magnificent to look at, but it doesn't do us any favours in terms of the audio. So my apologies if anyone is at all struggling with the sound. We're doing what we can do to mitigate that, and we will take the central column through next door for the discussions. So without any further ado, I want to just invite my colleague Alan Budge to speak to us on the subject matter of participatory budgeting. Alan.
Okay, good evening everybody. I've been working on this thing called participatory budgeting, PB for short, for 15 years now, and I still think it's a good idea. It hasn't worn off. I'm still as committed to it and as passionate about it as I was from day one. I've been working up in Scotland for the last 3 years, helping develop the PB programme north of the border here. I was watching a documentary a couple of nights ago. It's called The Accidental Anarchist. It's a guy called Khan Ross, who's a British diplomat, and he was working in the United Nations for a long time. And the documentary started with him in the United Nations chamber, and he was saying to the camera, the problem is that the people who are most affected by the decisions made in this chamber don't get anywhere near this room, ever. Do you see what I mean? So participatory budgeting is basically a mechanism that allows people that are affected by decisions to become part of that decision-making process. And that's really what we're talking about. So the definition there, people have direct decision-making powers over part of a public budget. And I won't go into chapter and verse, there isn't time, but PB began in Brazil in the 1980s. And one of the guys that was involved in the early days there said it feels like we've decided it's PB, feel that somebody else has decided it isn't. So it's a very simple idea, and the Scottish Government, in its wisdom, decided to run with this idea 3 years or so ago and develop PB as a national initiative, and that's part and parcel of what Glasgow have been very much involved in to date as well. So we know that PB's, it's become a worldwide phenomenon. Those organisations in the middle there, the acronyms UNESCO, DFID, OECD, that's really by way of saying this isn't something that was dreamed on the back of a beer mat one night in a Brazilian bar. It's got a lot of institutional academic and, experiential support behind it now. So it is an idea whose, not to say its moment has come, but it's definitely developing all the time. And the work in Scotland is a really, dynamic expression of the potential of PB, right now today, which is fabulous. Here's in the sort of Blue Peter spirit, here's one that we prepared earlier. If we're thinking about taking Glasgow more towards sustainable development of participatory budgeting at scale, and how on earth are we going to do that? Paris have been running a PB programme for a number of years now, and in 2015, that was the basic format there. There's loads of information about this on the website, the PB Network website, the PB Scotland website. So if you want to find out more information about any of this stuff, please feel free to, fossick around in there to your heart's content. But basically in Paris, the methodology is that the residents generate ideas themselves. They're put towards, they're involved in like a feasibility check. And, Michael Gove said, didn't he, that we've had enough of experts. But there are people within organisations, within the local authority, within other partner organisations, who have a lot of practical expertise about what works and what doesn't, and that's absolutely fine, as long as they don't then take the final decision away from the residents. So having that input is really important in working up PB at scale and how it can be delivered, at larger, sustainable, mainstream ways within a city such as Glasgow or Paris. So the feasibility check, the short list of 1,000 projects, was produced from that. 67,000 residents voted, which isn't a vast percentage of the population of Paris, which obviously runs into millions, but it's still a vast number of people actively involved, and £57 million was spent. So the methodology to actually develop something using mainstream council money across the city does exist. It's something that we're aware of. That learning can be shared out and thought about and developed wherever you want it to, obviously including Glasgow. Now that isn't to say that you must do your participatory budgeting like Paris does. That's not the idea at all. One of the key tenets, one of the key ideas behind PB is the process is owned by the participants. So if you're unhappy about the way PB is developing, and you can look at that in the questions later on, you've got every right to become involved in the planning process as well as the decision-making process of where the money gets spent at the end of the programme. So it's really important to keep that in mind. There aren't any them in PB. It's about us deciding together, how this money is going to be spent. Okay. So, excuse me. In the context in Scotland, the Community Empowerment Act, which has already been mentioned, I think, around, the legal framework to allow for requests to participate. So the legislative underpinning of PB is developing, it is in place now, and it's something that can be used to move a PB process forward up here in Scotland. So a new right for community bodies and places new duties on public authorities, and again, now is not the time to go into vast detail, but that legislation exists to support the idea of participatory budgeting, which is very helpful from our point of view in terms of getting the thing moving in the first place. We know the Scottish Government has expressed an aspiration for 1% of all local authority funding to be spent through PB, and I have to say that Glasgow is taking that aspiration very seriously. And that isn't unique to Glasgow. Other areas are actually looking at this, and saying, how are we going to do this? So the question isn't now, why on earth should we do this? It's become far more, how can we do it? And that's really interesting, I think, from our point of view. It's kind of like the argument for PB, hopefully it's as though it's been made. The question now becomes a more technical one about how we're going to deliver this. And that's part of what we can work together to help achieve and develop as we go forward. We know that £3 million has been made available from the Scottish Government for local authorities and for community sector organisations to develop PB. How many people in the room were involved in the Glasgow PB initiative over the last 18 months? So quite a few of you have been aware of it and been involved in it. So that's a good starting point, isn't it, to build up shared knowledge and shared information about how it's gone. The Scottish Government is part funding support for developing PB in Scotland, so they're paying us to help you develop PB. We're not here to tell you how to do it. We're here to hopefully problem solve and come up with some solutions and some answers to some of the questions you might have in terms of taking PB forward. We know that 24 out of 32 local authorities in Scotland are doing some form of PB, engaging with the PB idea in some way, shape or form, which is fabulous, because when the Scottish Government first made this suggestion 2.5, 3 years ago now, I think they'd have been delighted if they'd got half a dozen local authorities at the first bite. They'd have been over the moon with 10. They got 20 straight off the bat, and we now got 24, and the idea is we'll shame the other 8. into coming on board in due course. Scotland administratively is a small country. It's very large geographically, as I've been discovering in my travels over the last 2 years, but administratively it's a small country compared to England. There are 600 local authorities in England, so 24 out of 600 is a drop in the ocean, whereas up here we can reach a point of what you might call critical mass, comparatively quickly, and that is what's developing. We're part of a nationwide initiative to develop PB, within this country. So Scotland programme, we know that £3 million plus has already been spent. That figure's going up all the time. It's one of those little kind of tickers. It's happening all the time as we go along. There's a couple of examples there, and this slide's really by way of saying, the amount of money isn't really the point. The point is the principle that people own the process themselves and have the final decision-making powers over this pot of money, whatever it happens to be. In Aberdeenshire, there's a big issue, isn't there, at the moment around how to integrate National Health Service provision and social care provision, and they decided to put money into developing initiatives that would allow that to happen more effectively in Aberdeenshire. The Orkney project, their 35k, the reason I've put that up there is because people often say to me that we can't do PB here because the geography is too difficult. In Orkney, they had 12 islands, plus the mainland, 13 island groups, and they had to work out a way of having a PB process across all 12 islands, which was fair, which was representative, which worked well enough for the island communities involved. And they came up with a plan that worked. And the thing was, they had the £35,000 to spend, so they had to come up with a plan that would work well enough for them, and that's what they did. It was a very tough challenge, but they managed it. So if they can get these island communities to do PB across these very difficult geographical barriers, it's possible to deliver it in whatever geographical context, I would argue. The bottom one there, the carers provision one in Perth, that's by way of saying, a small amount of money can make a big difference. These were carers, full-time, non-professional carers for people with profound disabilities. They came and voted on that money themselves on a Saturday in a community centre. 56 carers turned up, and the demands on their time would have been enormous, but they made the space to do this, and they were the constituency most affected by where that money was going to go, and they came out and took the decisions themselves about how it's going to get spent. So relatively small amounts of money can make a massive difference if people have ownership of that decision-making process. But moving on more towards, mainstreaming PB, by which we mean, service providers funding budgets are being commissioned by residents. So residents decide where some of that money gets spent. It's not the entire Glasgow City Council budget being decided on a Saturday afternoon. That's not the idea at all. But a percentage of that money can be directly devolved to resident decision-making. We know in Edinburgh already they've put £500 of their mainstream youth services budget into a PB process. So they're literally putting their money where their mouth is and saying we're prepared to commit mainstream funds to the PB programme around youth provision, because that was a priority within Edinburgh. The Western Isles, which is what I was personally involved in, is a £500,000 bus project. The bus contracts were up for retendering. So the bus companies would fill out their tender documents and present them to the local authority, and they'd say, yes, we'll commission you, we won't commission them. The residents became the commissioning body. So we put this idea to the procurement department in Stornoway, in the Outer Hebrides, and to the transport management team. They all thought we'd gone mad. You must be joking. Residents won't be able to work to this level of detailed information. It's too difficult. It's too complicated. The bus companies won't wear it. Well, we got there. The bus companies had to become far more responsive to the residents' needs as a result of this. And I was in the room where the residents were actually going through these tenders with a fine-tooth comb. It wasn't just timetables and fares. It was environmental impact. It was community impact. A lot of different categories, safety and all the rest of it. And they came to conclusions that the transport manager at the end of it was perfectly happy with. So it shows that, we can get into more technical areas of PB around different areas of service provision, depending on which ones are most amenable to a PB approach. And the Minister for Communities and Housing in Scotland, a guy called Kevin Stewart, who you may have come across in your travels maybe, he won't stop talking about it. He says, have you heard about the Western Isles bus programme? He's very, very behind it. And interestingly, he says that he sees PB primarily as a community engagement tool rather than a budget cutting or a budgetary exercise. That's quite interesting, and that's coming from that particular perspective, because that's really what PB is about as much as how the money gets spent. It's about people being engaged in something that means something to them. Whereas a lot of consultation exercises often don't. And the thing that Oliver did earlier, where there's only a handful of people left, he felt had some meaningful influence on the community forums they attended, I think shows that up very clearly. Whereas hopefully with PB, the people still standing at the end of the exercise would be far greater. So bringing it back home into Glasgow, the PB process so far, the strategic direction of Glasgow City Council, we will introduce real community-based participatory budgeting. There are people in the room that know a lot more about this than I do, so obviously these kind of policy decisions are there to be thought about and worked up together in partnership with the Council to launch a community empowerment unit with the Council to support the Road to Scotland's largest participatory budgeting scheme. So no pressure then, that's a great aspiration as far as I'm concerned. Capacity building programme. What is PB? So the council did an exercise whereby they got over 300 members of staff, skilled up in how PB was going to be delivered and what it meant, what its core principles were, providing training and development and bespoke support to 50 members of staff, and also awareness raising and capacity building within community organisations where, again, over 50 individuals were skilled up and brought on board in terms of what PB actually was and what it meant, and that then translated into a small grants PB programme 2016-17, 29 events at ward level. We think, is Evelyn there? Hello, we think it's about £300,000 was allocated altogether, was it? Is it? I can't quite see the graphic from here, I can't remember. 370,000. So we're talking about small grants, but that's a big chunk of money, out of the budget. I mean, it was from the Scottish Government's Community Choices Fund. It was match funded locally, wasn't it? That's how it was rolled out, which is a great method. So, you're already up and running. You've already had a taste for PB, and the challenge now is to move that into a more mainstream PB process. And for my money, to kind of phrase, it's at the community planning level where this can take place, because some interventions that come out of a community plan can be addressed through local community groups and organisations through a kind of small grants process. Some of the priorities identified through community planning can be commissioned from the mainstream service providers and pulled down by residents through that route. But it's at the community planning process where those priorities can be identified and the responses, whether it's a small grants or a more mainstream intervention, can be identified and worked through to deliver PB right across the spectrum on the basis of the community plans that have been generated, locality by locality. So in terms of mainstreaming PB, there's been funded support for PB. We're working together to develop a framework for mainstream participatory budgeting, which is part of what this evening's about as well in terms of the conversations, the questions we'll be looking at it in a few minutes, developing mainstream ideas to identify mainstream budgets. So that's it. Those are the websites where you can get more information. If you just Google PB in Scotland, those will come up no problem. And I think the questions are on the table rather than on here, aren't they? So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. The next presentation is on behalf of the Development Trust Association Scotland, and it's my colleague Linda Gillespie who's going to provide that presentation. Linda.
Good evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in this magnificent hall. Over the next 10 minutes, I thought I would just outline asset transfer and the new rights and processes available to communities. I work for the Community Ownership Support Service that's run through the Development Trust Association Scotland. We are funded by the Scottish Government to support the sustainable transfer of publicly held assets into community ownership. And that supports, it's an advisor-led service, and we support both communities and public bodies in the transfer of assets. So really, since 2003, with the introduction of the Land Reform Act, which brought the community right to buy, the policy and legislative framework in Scotland has been developed to support strong, resilient communities, and which asset transfer and community ownership is seen as part of that. Currently, there are 540,000 acres of land in community ownership. There is a target of making that 1 million acres by 2020. 80% of the Western Isles is in community ownership. And it's fair to say that Glasgow is no stranger to community ownership and control, being at the forefront of community-controlled housing. There are numerous community organisations across the city that are asset owners. So community ownership of land and buildings is seen to help create confident, better resourced and more sustainable communities. With the introduction of the Community Empowerment Act in 2015, brought Part 5 asset transfer, which went live in January this year, So the communities have the right to request to purchase, lease, manage or use land and buildings belonging to local authorities and all other Scottish public bodies. That's the police, that's the fire, that's the NHS, that's Scottish Enterprise, that's some colleges. So it's not just Glasgow City Council's assets, it's the whole public sector across Glasgow will be subject to asset transfer requests from yourselves, potentially. The assets that you request don't necessarily need to be surplus to requirements or in a surplus list. Indeed, you could ask for the transfer of this magnificent building. We'll come on to whether you would want to. Communities also have the ability to state how much they're prepared to pay for the assets or how much they want to pay. And if that's below market value or at a discount, then the discount is justified against the social, economic and environmental benefits your proposal will bring. The presumption is in favour of communities unless there are reasonable grounds to refuse. So if you did want the City Chambers, Glasgow City Council would have legitimate grounds for refusing the asset transfer. If you were interested in taking on an asset below market value, not paying full market value price is not in of itself a good enough reason for refusing an asset transfer request. So any requests have to be subject to the benefits that you're going to bring. There are timescales for responses from all public sector bodies in terms of when they come back to you, the decision-making times, and there is a review and an appeal. So for local authorities, there's an internal review should the decision be adverse, and there's a further appeal to Scottish ministers, and all public sector asset owners will be subject to an appeal to ministers. And all public bodies will also have to publish annual reports of the number of requests, what action was taken and what the results of those requests were. So, who's eligible? Well, these rights eligibility is for communities of place, so geographically defined communities, and communities of interest. And those are communities of interest could be community groups, social enterprises, single-issue organisations or faith-based organisations. It isn't actually necessarily what they are as an organisation, it's what their governance structures are. So for a lease management arrangements, everybody will have to have a constitution. They need to be open and democratically accountable to their members and run by their members. And that's a particularly key kind of control aspect within the requirements of the Act. And they have to operate for the benefit of that defined community. For the transfer of ownership, there is a requirement that the community bodies have a legal structure, and that's a non-profit distributing company limited by guarantee, a SCIO, Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, or a BENCOM, and that there's a minimum of 20 members. Where it's a company limited by guarantee, then it must have an appropriate dissolution clause. Obviously, SCIOs and BENCOMs are covered by kind of charitable rules. In the next couple of slides, I thought I would just cover the very early stage processes in terms of up to a community making a community asset transfer request. Now, Glasgow City Council have guidance notes and a very helpful question and answer section in their site. And the Scottish Government have a full section on guidance notes for communities making asset transfer requests. So, in an ideal world, communities would identify the needs of the community and then look at the public estate to see if there were assets that were fit for purpose. It can be very difficult if you are coming after a building that you know is closing and you've got a very tight timescale to come after it, and you as a community want to save that building. So if you galvanise around a particular building to save that building without having a genuine sense of what the needs are of the community, it can actually be a very difficult road to take, particularly if you're forming a group to take that on. The relevant authorities will have a full section of their assets that are available to them, and that's on an area-based level, so actually you can search that by postcode. So it's actually just about knowing what your kind of needs are in your community, and then actually just seeing what's fit for purpose. So although it may be a city council asset, the NHS may be sitting on a more appropriate asset for the needs of your community. It is, I should kind of point out at this stage, if an asset is already being marketed, then your ability to put in an asset transfer request is minimised. You can certainly still put in an asset transfer request, but if it is being marketed, then your request will be considered against any other private sector bids. So you don't actually have any kind of exclusive right to come forward for that asset if it's already being marketed, and the Community Empowerment Act doesn't cover you on that. You can still bid for it, but you will be bidding for it against potentially other private sector bidders. So just kind of thought I'd put that note on it. And then once you've actually identified your building, the guidance is certainly very much about, this is still at the very informal stage of an asset transfer, the asset transfer approach. And it is recommended that this is kind of open and consultative, and that actually you get into a kind of constructive dialogue with the owner of the asset, because you will be wanting information from them about usage, condition of the building, kind of any kind of factors that they are aware of about this building, to have that made available to you. It is also an opportunity to discuss your outline plans from them, because the actual current public sector owner may well actually be a key stakeholder for what your plans are for that building going forward. So, you know, there's a community in the Highlands that's looking for NHS land to build supported housing accommodation for people in their community. So the NHS, so it will be NHS land that they're looking to have transferred to them, but the NHS themselves will be a key customer of them. And then obviously kind of shaping your plans to a formal asset transfer request. So once you actually put in an asset transfer request, this is now you triggering the formal process. So you will be asked to say who you are, how you're constituted, what you plan to do with the building, and give an indication of where you're going to secure funding. Increasingly, there will also be a requirement to show how you plan to make the building sustainable, and kind of what level of community support you have for it, both from your actual community and from your stakeholders. Once you've submitted a formal asset transfer request, then you are triggering the process. So if the local authority or public sector asset holder is confident that they have all the information they require from you to make a decision, then a validation note will be triggered. So that actually is a prohibition on sale for up to 6 months to consider your application. So that, from a community point of view, that's where you've submitted your formal asset transfer request, and then it just goes into the decision-making process. I thought I would sort of finish with kind of some of the takeaways from the 6 years that we've had of supporting community groups. And the key thing from our point of view is to be proactive, to identify the needs, to identify the assets you're interested in. You know, you're in a city that has high demand on assets. Once things start to move, they'll move very quickly. And as a community, you'll run to catch up if an asset's looking as though it's going to be surplus. So by being proactive, then you can be very clear about the community assets that you value and that you would consider taking ownership of. I would recommend that you consider it on an area basis. I think it's true to say that a high proportion of the community groups we support operate on a kind of threat and opportunity basis. So it's the threat of losing particular buildings and the services delivered within those. Sometimes it's iconic buildings, it's former town halls, clock towers, those types of assets. So if you're reacting to the threat of a particular building closing, it can be quite difficult for you to retrofit services into it, particularly if you're not fully aware of what the needs of your community is. And then obviously building community support and partnerships across the piece. You know, running and keeping assets sustainable is not an easy thing to do. So actually your partnerships across the public sector, private sector, and obviously the level of community support will be key to kind of a successful asset transfer, and focus on your business model. How are you actually going to keep this sustainable? Even if it's about civic space, you still need to generate income to keep it sustainable. So I would say out of our sort of 6 years of working with assets, they would be our key takeaways. And just finally, there are questions on your table to consider in terms of the challenges that you think you'll have within the city to take on assets and kind of your own needs. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And we're now going to move seamlessly, hopefully, to a presentation by my colleague Brendan Frangate, who's going to share some of the things that his department and service, Land and Environmental Services, are currently doing in the subject matter of improving your local environment. Brendan, thank you.
Thanks, Shaw. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to discuss improving your local environment. I work with Land and Environmental Services, and we deliver cleansing, parks and road services for those who don't know, but I know we're a large part of the council organisation. So tonight I'm going to talk about the impact of austerity on service delivery, effective citizen engagement, community partnership opportunities, and most importantly, empowering communities and decision making. So following the economic downturn in 2008, austerity and budgetary constraints meant that we needed to do more for less. The Council began an extensive transformation programme. Land and Environmental Services introduced 7-day working for the first time. Plant machinery was aligned to the new working pattern, and depots were rationalised. Then, on the run-up to the 2014 Commonwealth Games, additional funding was provided. This meant that Glasgow had never looked better, and the best ever Commonwealth Games was successfully delivered. We experienced a tangible pride in our city. We can see from the huge efforts what was possible in terms of improving our urban environment. It gave us the realisation of what could be done. Since then, austerity and the drive for efficiencies has continued, but the Council is committed to effective citizen engagement to help shape resources. And I'm here tonight to find out what your views are on this matter. So in terms of effective citizen engagement, the existing forms that we use are area partnerships and community councils. Officers present programmes of work such as cleansing in Glasgow and the roads investment strategy to area partnerships. The area partnerships are made up of elected members, community councillors, there's a lot of you here tonight, and community groups as well. Land and Environmental Services present papers twice a year and submit reports 4 times a year to these forums. Community officers regularly attend community council meetings, council officers regularly attend community council meetings, and we are there to listen to issues and concerns, and this helps deliver us to design and provide effective service delivery. Later in the presentation, I will discuss how we are developing engagement with registered social landlords and resident committees to empower citizens. I'll talk about 3 community partnership opportunities. The first one is in response to concerns over environmental degradation, such as dog fouling, fly tipping, littering and graffiti. Land and Environmental Services has been working in partnership with Community Safety Glasgow, housing associations, community councils and volunteer groups to create cleaner and stronger local communities. A new social media contact process has been established so that residents can, for the first time, let us know about their environmental issues by using Twitter and Facebook and My Glasgow app. Also, the use of mobile technology has improved the responsiveness and effectiveness of the environmental clean-up teams as jobs can be sent to them in real time. Officers have been visiting schools to work with kids on the importance of maintaining and improving their local environment. It's hoped that the kids will embrace the message that we're telling them and assist them in behavioural change. Another exciting neighbourhood or community partnership opportunity is neighbourhood delivery model. A number of registered social landlords have ongoing arrangements to use Land and Environmental Services, plant machinery and vehicles in support of environmental activity. Building on this work, Land and Environmental Services is to commence 2 neighbourhood delivery model pilots. These are exciting proposals as they can make a real difference locally. The first pilot is going to be in Millbank and Denniston, which will commence in September 2017, and the second is going to be in South Nitshill, Darnley, and that will commence in October 2017. The pilots will deploy resources, local resources, to improve street sweeping and litter collection, grass cutting and winter maintenance. Service level agreements will be drawn up to ensure that these services are closely monitored and so that the quality and compliance is met. Land and Environmental Services already have operatives who live in the pilot neighbourhoods. A number of these operatives will be realigned to work with their partners in the pilots. The exciting part is because the operatives are local, they'll be aware of and take ownership of their local environmental issues. They will be motivated to make a real environmental difference in their local communities. Their operatives will be trained based in their neighbourhoods, depots, and so will not be travelling from remote depots, so there will be reduced travelling times and they can be more effectively working on the streets for longer. The pilots will help to prove the localism concept works. The issues that arise will be addressed so that lessons will be learned in advance of rolling out to other neighbourhoods. At this point in the presentation, I would like to play you a little audio clip, which I've found very inspirational. And the real emphasis is how a simple idea can make a huge impact in people's lives. So hopefully, fingers crossed, technology works with me, and I'll play this clip for you now.
50 things that made the modern economy.
Nearly 20 years ago, poor families in Coahuila State in Mexico were offered an unusual handout from a social program called Piso Firme. It wasn't a place at school, a vaccination, corn for tortillas, or even money. It was $150 worth of ready-mixed concrete. Workers would drive concrete mixers through poor neighbourhoods, stop outside the home of the needy family that were waiting for them, and pour out the porridge-like mixture through the door right into the living room. Then they'd show the occupants how to spread and smooth the gloop and make sure they knew how long to leave it to dry. And then off they'd drive to the next appointment with the next family. Piso Firme means firm floor. And when economists studied the program, they found that the ready-mixed concrete dramatically improved children's education. How so? Previously, the floors were made of dirt. Parasitic worms thrive in dirt, spreading diseases that stunt kids' growth and make them miss school. Concrete floors are much easier to keep clean, so the kids were healthier and their test scores improved. And parents in the program's households became happier, less stressed, and less prone to depression. That seems to be $150 well spent.
Fermo is a fantastic example of how a simple idea can truly transform people's lives. The third partnership opportunity I'll talk to you about just now is the bin replacement programme. Again, another very simple idea which responds to concerns highlighted at area partnerships and community council meetings. The council has provided £6.5 million in funding to replace 50,000 galvanised, or maybe known as ash bins, in tenement properties throughout the city. The replacement green and blue wheelie bins will improve containment. It will also increase recycling opportunities and support an effective modern refuse collection service. The bin replacement programme will be undertaken in 3 phases over 3 years, commencing with a pilot in the northwest of the city, which is about to commence in October 2017. Then the programme will be rolled out to the northeast in April 2018 and the south of the city in 2019. Land Environmental Services is closely engaging with registered social landlords and resident committees to deliver the bin replacement programme. With the funding in place, registered social landlords can now push ahead with backcourt and bin store refurbishment programmes without the need to pay for replacement bins. My colleagues in waste management are reviewing backcourt refurbishment plans and ideas to ensure that the required containment for refuse and cycling and safe access is provided. Families can increase recycling and reduce general waste. Refurbished backcourts can become amenity spaces where kids can play safely, possibly for the first time. The backcourts could be, for instance, used as a drying green, or maybe perhaps even to grow produce, or maybe be used for bike storage. Modern, well-designed backcourts will reduce missed refuse collections and improve yours and other customer satisfaction. A couple of examples of these improved backcourts already in Glasgow are on the next slide, and just to give you a flavour of what can be possible in terms of what a modern and efficient backcourt and bin store area looks like. So I'll move on to empowering communities and effective decision making. So in terms of that, what else should land and environmental services be doing to make sure local voices are heard? The presentation highlights how land environmental services are delivering effective and responsive neighbourhood services. However, I want to find out from you how land and environmental services can help build your capacity to support community empowerment and improvement. So in summary, it's about citizen engagement, community partnership opportunities, but most importantly, it's about empowering communities and decision making. Ladies and gentlemen, it's about us working together. It's not just about what the Council wants to do. It's really important that you tell us what your ideas are so that we can take them forward. So finally, it's your neighbourhood. What can you do to help improve your local environment? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. That was very helpful. What we're now going to do is move into the workshop situation, and again, being very conscious of the echo in here. We're going to take the entire middle section, and if you can go through the two back doors and through literally next door to the Satinwood, that's where your workshops will be conducted. So we've got some workshop time now. Each workshop, each table will have 3 questions which have been posed by the speakers. We'd ask you to consider those and then feed back to the panel session later on some of your deliberations and considerations. So into the workshop session now, and if I could ask the middle column, asset transfer, to move through to the Satinwood suite, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Take your seat, and we're just going to move into the last bit of the evening, please. Can I ask members of the panel to sit at the top table, please? I'm just going to have to be risky and take it from the floor because time's beating us, but there's no chance of coordinating otherwise. Thank you.
That's purely provided by people, so if you have to end up being forced to pick off questions.
I don't know who'd answer that one yet.
I haven't had a chance to properly digest that one, but it's slightly problematic.
Okay. Ask the guys in the corner to get them, please. Colleagues, can I ask members of the panel to come? Brendan. Alan Budge. No, if you just grab a seat there, because things might come to you or they might go to George, so. Oliver, George, Alan, Linda. Billy Robertson, how you doing? Roving mics, where are they? Colleagues, thank you very much. We're now going into the panel session, but I'm sure you're all conscious of the time, so we're going to do this slightly differently. Okay, can we kill conversation, please? Okay. The panel here is now ready, willing and able to answer questions. Because of constraints in time, we're going to do questions from the floor and a couple of questions that have already been passed to my good self. All the panel members are familiar to you, with one exception, and he's going to wave at you in a second, just to embarrass him. My colleague George Gillespie, who's the Executive Director for Land and Environmental Services. So George has got significant responsibilities in the city for many of the services that are upfront and personal for everyone that lives within the city boundaries. I fully appreciate that we're tight for time, so what I'm going to do is I will give you an assurance that just before 2:15 I will hand over to Bailey Robertson, who's going to give a couple of minutes of concluding comments, so we will finish no more than 10 minutes over our time. But what I'm going to do is also take a bit of a risk and take questions from the floor. We've got 2 roving mics, but to kick us off, one of the questions that did feed back to us was, and this is from one of the folks in the audience, LES has stated that they work with social landlords and community groups. What would LES do if identified community group is challenged by another community group? How would it choose? How does it go about resolving some of these issues within its communities? And I'm going to pass that tricky question to my colleague George Gillespie. George.
Is this working? Yep. Obviously, Brendan mentioned we are engaging in 2 pilots to promote the bin replacement programme, but also in terms of that engagement in the wider sense, looking at street scene. In terms of that disagreement between 2 community groups, the purpose of the engagement with the registered social landlords is really for them as the anchor tenant within that local area to work with us, to work with the City Council in respect of the resources that we currently have and the resources that they have. And as the anchor tenant, our expectation is that they're able to engage with those local community groups probably better than we can. They obviously know the area well, and they know the individual groups on a personal basis, and it's better for us to engage with that tenant, that anchor tenant effectively, to look at the services that we provide within that local area. Our expectation again is that we have operatives. Most of the RSLs also have operatives, whether it be community janitors or something similar in terms of environmental operatives. And we also have the vehicles, the plant, the equipment, and sometimes we have the skills to engage with those RSLs. And our ambition is really for a partnership working which will expand beyond those two individual RSLs within the city, in order that we are providing joint working and joint partnerships throughout the entire city. So for me, it's very much moving the discussion, if you like, in terms of local service delivery to the RSLs, albeit we will still be involved, we'll still ensure that service delivery is maintained, but for the RSL to take more of a lead within that local community and to do that consultation and dialogue with those local community groups.
Thank you, George. Obviously, if anybody wants to pick up on some of the detail of that, there won't be a great time after we finish at 2:45, but none of us are running away. So if you do want to pick up some issues in detail, please feel free to so do. The next one, a wee advance warning, Linda, this one's coming your way. It's been asked that what support is available for community organisations to compete for community access when most communities don't have the capacity, especially in cases where larger organisations such as a housing provider might already be, quote, in the know. Linda.
Actually, that's a very good question. I think it's fair to say Glasgow City has quite an extensive infrastructure of support organisations, from Jobs and Business Glasgow, Business Gateway and Community Enterprise in Strathclyde. We also provide advisor support just on every stage of asset transfer. In terms of early stage groups, asset transfer can take a long time. I mean, we have groups that we've been working with for years. So getting that kind of early stage organisational support is quite key to a successful transfer. So it is about tapping into the resource within the City Council and other organisations. So it's quite extensive, and we can follow up after this workshop in terms of what that infrastructure in Glasgow looks like.
Thank you, Linda. At this time, I'm going to do that risky thing and throw it open to the floor. There were 2 or 3 people who made a big point of saying we haven't had a chance to articulate our question yet, but can I ask from the floor? So there's roving mics. Mr Munro, Dan Munro, in the centre there, if you can get a mic there. And Teresa, is your? Yep, and if we can go to Teresa after that.
Right, thank.
On you go. It's on.
Hello? You here? Yeah, okay. Right, I just want to pose a question. How realistic is it in terms of asset transfer in the current financial climate? My mind kind of strays not to community facilities, etc., that the community wish to take on. I'm just wondering how realistic that is, because I've always advocated that in a community taking on a community facility, there always will be an existing need for core budgets to be applied and transferred from the council to that organisation.
Initially, I'll ask Linda maybe very briefly to touch on that and then throw it open to the wider panel. I think Bailey Robertson may well want to come into that from a political perspective. Thank you.
I mean, I think the key thing about this is that you actually choose the right asset and that you're not actually just chasing a particular building because that's been the centre that you've always used. Your point about revenue funding is well made, and actually finding a sustainable way to run facilities is absolutely key, because budgets are decreasing across the board. So I agree with you. There are communities using things like balancing assets that generate surpluses. They've got public sector partners who take anchor tenancies. They've got delivering service level agreements for public sector organisations. or they operate in a kind of very tight stewardship model where it's effectively just washing its face. So there are a range of options out there that each group's you need to look at, but there are some buildings that you just should say no because they're not assets, they're just liabilities.
Thank you. I can understand the background, having worked with you, Tam, in various asset transfers in the past. Bailey Robertson, you want to comment?
Yeah, just for time factor, absolutely agree entirely with that. Fantastic, relevant question. You mentioned my role as the city administration. Well, this was part of our manifestos, this was part of our pledges, and it's my job and my administration's job to effect it and make it into policy, but above all, policy delivery. So the role would be, Mr Monroe, would be enablement, facilitating, encouraging and supporting. Hopefully we gave a few examples of that tonight. But what I'll say to everyone when I concluded my opening speech, my keynote speech, was we've got years to come. Anything in this room tonight is definitely not a sprint, it's a marathon. And as I said clearly earlier, my job is to enable and support, not me personally, but your elected members in their respective wards in the areas that we all live in.
Thank you. I saw one other hand up there, Gerald. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm just wondering about communities of interest, because all three areas that we've been speaking about tonight have tended to take a place-based focus. So, for example, I work for Glasgow Disability Alliance, which is run by and for and with disabled people, and we've got almost 4,000 members. So we want in on PB and asset transfer and all of these things as much as any of the area-based communities, and I just wondered about the panel's perspective on that.
Thank you for that question, Teresa. I'm aware of this question because the Council, as many of you will know, has adopted a place-based approach through Thriving Places, and we are very acutely aware that the local place-based approach does not necessarily serve all communities of interest well, but I'll hand that one to Bailey Robertson to make a comment on as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you very much for the invitation yesterday when I addressed your GDA summit. And the point is really relevant to what you asked. Let's capture that in the community plan. It's an opportunity. As I mentioned earlier again, it's conclusion the 31st of August. We have to capture that. You're key in it. I made that commitment yesterday. You've got 5 kind of action points how you're delivering that. And I think it's making best use of all resources out there. Expertise. It's not about everyone in this building who's either employed, some of the officers sitting at the table, or myself as an elected member and some of my friends and colleagues in the audience tonight. And I'll use that opportunity to thank them for coming along and supporting it tonight. But for me, it's realising potential, expertise, and sharing that expertise across the board as we move forward.
Thank you. Alan, you want to come in?
Very quick. Yeah, I think PB does lend itself to communities of interest. The example I put it very briefly around the carers community in Perth, they were the community that were voting on that project. And actually, if there's a bespoke fund for a particular community of interest, then PB can be opened up to that community very readily. So it's something that certainly doesn't exclude communities of interest.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question. The lady over here's had her hand up for longest, so I'm going to take one more question and then just ask Bailey Robertson to conclude business by with 2 minutes of concluding remarks. Thank you.
Glasgow City Council allows charities to use its parks for free, which is great, but who pays for the damage that's caused to the parks by running these events? LAS say they don't have the budget, so the damage has been left year in, year out.
George, can I maybe ask you to address something?
In terms of Glasgow's parks, what we do is we try to encourage a whole range of organisations to make best use of the parks, as well as make commercial use of them, obviously for concerts, etc. What we do in the commercial sense is very much we charge the organisation for any damage that may have incurred during the event. My officers examine the area, the park beforehand and thereafter. And again, we can recharge that back to the particular organisation. As far as charities are concerned, you're absolutely right. As far as the council are concerned, they get free use within the parks themselves. But again, in terms of the damage, in doing that in working in partnership with the charities, etc., is very much a maintenance cost, which is borne by the council. But in terms of our ongoing management and maintenance of the parks, that's just part and parcel of the daily service delivery. But we certainly do in the larger scale events. Most events that we have, if there is any damage at all to the parks, then we do recharge it back to that particular organisation. But in general, it's the general maintenance running of the park that pays for it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm glad we finished that. Again, no plenary, no summation of tonight. It's just a thank you and a massive thank you. And if you can show your appreciation, please, to our panel members for the contributions and coming out tonight. Yeah. And I think the biggest thank you and the biggest applause, and you're going to give it yourself, and we're also going to share it with you, is for yourself to share your knowledge, your expertise, but above all, your enthusiasm, your openness. You've been candid, you've been frank. It's, as I said earlier, and we'll finish on that, it was my group's, this new administration, to move from manifesto pledges to now to policy, and I think now to finish on, it's time to move from discussion to delivery, and thank you very much.